All right. So I want to thank you all for tuning in today and inviting me to come and talk to you about one of my absolute favorite topics, and that is growing tomatoes. It is it's no secret to most people that actually growing tomatoes is it's the single most commonly grown vegetable crop in American gardens. So summertime is really what we're all waiting for, is time to grow tomatoes or when to plant them. And there's always the go-to varieties that people know, types of tomatoes that have some name recognition. I think most people are familiar with Early Girl, not only because it has a catchy name, but it's been around for a long time and people know it as a reliable producer of tomatoes, kind of regardless of the season. But what I want to talk about today is kind of the different kind of pro tips, basically, on growing tomatoes that we have found over the years, as well as some differences between heirloom and hybrid, and you see all those terms and what that means, and talk about some varieties of tomatoes that we have found to be not only prolific and do well in the Pacific Northwest, but to be very popular as far as flavor goes when you eat them. So, of course, that's the most important thing about growing tomatoes, is how they taste when you pick them. So the kind of the basics on the handout you'll see, and I'm going to run through some of these things. Sunlight. So tomatoes do love sun, and the average amount of sun for a tomato to grow would be 6 hours or more. And that would be for kind of the whole range of tomatoes, from big beefsteaks to tiny cherries. They all do great in 6 to 8 hours or even more sun. But if you have a partially shady environment, or perhaps only sun for half of the day, you can kind of use a rule of thumb that the smaller the fruit, the less sun is required. So cherry tomatoes will actually do quite well in filtered light or part shade, but I wouldn't expect a big hamburger-sized, slicer tomato to do so well in that kind of sunlight. Now, tomatoes can also be grown in containers, or they can be grown in the ground. But when do we plant them? It has a couple of factors that we're all waiting for to line up to give us the kind of green light to plant tomatoes. One factor is the soil temperature. Now, if you're growing in pots or in raised beds or containers, your soil temperature warms up closer to air temperature, but it can also then swing back down to chilly nighttime temperatures. Raised beds and containers, soil temperature is closer related to air temperature than actual in-ground soil. In-ground soil takes longer to warm up. Over the several weeks of good sunny weather in the spring will start to warm up our soil in the ground. And what we are waiting for conditions on tomatoes is, I use a soil thermometer at home. This is a soil thermometer which goes from -10 degrees to 120 degrees. Gives you a pretty quick reading in the soil, and we are waiting for at least 50 degrees and even preferably 60 degrees in soil for our tomatoes to be happy going into that soil. And if we plant in too cold of soil, the tomato gets like that perma-cold that can actually stunt its growth, so that it doesn't, it has a delay, and in many cases won't take off even as quickly as a tomato that's planted later when the soil temperature does come up to better temperatures. So first is soil temperature. Second is nighttime temperature. So nighttime averages in the 50s is really the lowest that a tomato would like to see. And we've had really beautiful warm nights over the month of April. But now if you look in your 10-day forecast, today we have a little bit of a chill, and 10-day forecast shows most of the days, most of the nighttime temperatures in the next 10 days in the high 40s and a few in the low 50s. So we're not quite averaging that 50 degrees at nighttime to give us that extra warmth. Most kind of seasoned gardeners in the Willamette Valley or Portland metro area use Mother's Day as the kind of target date for planting tomatoes. So most of us are waiting until warmer nights and warm soil temperatures catch up with all of this great weather we've had, and that tends to be right around Mother's Day. Now that's the second week in May, so we're very close to that Mother's Day planting, but my soil, so I use a soil thermometer at home, and my soil this morning was just at 50 degrees, and it was actually warm. That's in the ground, so it was warmer than the air temperature was this morning when I took the soil temperature, but I'm going to let it come up more before I actually put my tomatoes in the ground. Now, when it does come to planting time, there are, again, options of in the ground, in your raised beds, or if you don't have either and you live on a balcony or a houseboat, you have nothing but pots to grow your tomatoes in. So container grown tomatoes are perfectly fine to attempt, but the bigger the container, the better your success is going to be. So I have some examples of container sizes to talk through, and the first is your minimum size pot. So this will be your minimum size pot. This is kind of the equivalent to like a 5-gallon bucket or a 5-gallon nursery container. This is 12 inches across and 12 inches deep, so this is a 12-inch pot. This is the smallest pot you could grow a bush style tomato in, but I would not try to grow a more vining tomato in this small of a container. And I'm going to get to that in just a minute, what those two kind of different types of growth habits are, but let me get through this pot part. So 5-gallon pot for determinate or bush style tomatoes, one plant in here. And right now that looks really funny because you're looking at one tiny plant in this great big pot, but it's going to grow to fill it within the next couple of months. So we want to give it all the space that it needs. The other two sizes, and maybe they're not the best for your tiny balcony, hopefully, but I would be going for a container about this size, but the smaller container, this is a 15-gallon and this is a 20-gallon. So we are going to expect a large growing tomato, one that grows more like a vine, to actually get up to almost 5-6 feet tall in a single season. And the bigger the plant is, of course, the more places for it to grow tomatoes on. And the bigger the pot, the larger your plant's able to grow. And also you don't have to water it like 3 times a day. So a great big plant in a tiny pot often doesn't get the water it needs, might blow over in a hot, windy day. So again, going with the larger containers is better. Now, if you are planting in the ground or in containers, again, it's all about the quality of the soil that you use to get your plants started. And tomatoes are notoriously heavy feeders, so they require kind of a high nutrition to really perform. And when I talk about nutrition and edibles, one of the things that I like to kind of bring to the front of our minds is about the importance of nutrition. So when we expect high performance from our vegetable plants, we put them in and we expect to get at least 20 pounds of tomatoes from an average tomato plant. And to get that type of performance from the tomato, we need to treat it like an athlete, you know, and give it the athlete support that nutrition provides so that it can give us that type of crop yield. In the potting soil, usually there's a little bit of like a water soluble nutrient package, but we want to give like a longer term reservoir basically of nutrients for the plant so that as it grows, it's got some resources to draw on. So what we recommend, and again, you will see the kind of planting recipe on your handout, what we put in the hole, whether that's in a pot or in the ground, to grow tomatoes includes let's see, a half a cup of lime, which is calcium carbonate. Lime sweetens our soil, so it's not quite as acidic as it normally is, but lime also adds calcium, which is an important component for tomato growth. In addition, more calcium comes from bone meal. So we add a half cup lime and a half cup bone meal. And then we add about a quarter cup of the tomato, vegetable, and herb fertilizer. So all three of these are organic and kind of work together to give nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, plus sweeten the soil a little and provide a boost of calcium to the plant, which is critical as the fruits are developing later in the season. In fruit development, when we're lacking in calcium, one of the things that you'll notice on plants is it's not a disease, but it's a dysfunction of the tomato fruit called blossom end rot. And blossom end rot, if we're looking at a tomato, blossom end rot would be when the bottom of the tomato fruit, underside of the tomato, turns kind of a discolored gray or a leathery brown color. Sometimes it kind of gets sunken or flat on the bottom. The cause of blossom end rot is lack of calcium. And so loading up that hole with the bone meal, the calcium carbonate or lime, and then that tomato vegetable fertilizer actually has 10% calcium, really gives the plant the calcium it needs so that as those cells are developing in that fruit, we have less of a chance of seeing that blossom end rot. Now on container grown plants, irregular watering can also be a cause of the blossom end rot, of that sunken bottom on the tomatoes. So you just want to be really consistent with your watering when you're growing in containers, just so that, again, you don't have that problem with the tomatoes. Blossom end rot, like I said, is not a disease. You can cut it out of the tomato, but you're not going to win any like state fair tomato contests with it, or really impress your neighbors by bringing them a bushel of tomatoes that all have, funny bottoms. So it can be corrected even in the mid-season of growth, so that like the next flush of tomatoes, if you add some calcium or improve your watering, will be better, and you won't always have that on every fruit. So and that same recipe is also great for peppers, squash, and eggplant. So you can put all those same types of ingredients into the whole for those other crops that you're growing as well. When we look at a lot of the different tomato varieties that are available, there are some terms that are kind of, on the tags and thrown around that I want to at least, explain what they mean. And to go back to container growing, I'm going to start with the two terms that you see quite often on tags. And one is determinant. So determinant is the term that you will see that describes the growth habit of the plant. And a determinant tomato stays short and bushy. It's the best one to be grown, again, in the small pots, like the 5-gallon bucket size. A determinant tomato ends up at about 2 to 3 feet tall and produces all of its crop at once over about a 3-week period. So it's not the type of tomato that continues to produce fruit until frost, like many of our more vining types. A determinant tomato allows you to, grow a crop of tomatoes, pull enough to make sauce or salsa or something great, and then you can take it out of the pot and grow something else in that container. So you can kind of get in, get out, and grow something next, rather than kind of marrying your tomato and, living with it all summer long like most of us do. I nurse every little tomato onto the end like it's my precious child. And if there's a tomato left on Thanksgiving, I feel like I've done a great job. So sometimes we, see them continue to produce, and other times, depending on the varieties, they may do it all at once. Now, the opposite of a determinant plant is an indeterminate plant. And indeterminate tomatoes are what most of us are familiar with. And those are the very tall, vining style tomatoes that can get 6, 8 feet, even taller if you let them. Most cherry tomato varieties are grown as indeterminate type plants, so they end up needing a large pot. They also need a cage of some sort to give them all of the support that they need as they grow tall, or they'll go all over the ground, which of course makes it really hard to pick and see what's ripe, and slugs and other critters end up eating them when they're on the ground. So determinate versus indeterminate. Determinate tomatoes, taller, viney, and they will produce their crop until really the end of summer, or things kind of slow and cool in fall. Where a determinate, 2 to 3 feet tall, short and bushy, produces its tomato crop over about a 3-week period, and then it's done. Now you will also see tags that show heirloom as a well-known term on a tag. So heirloom tomato versus one that just says tomato. So heirlooms have gotten a lot of popularity over the I don't know, last decade or whatever, and for really good reason. Heirloom tomatoes have been saved and shared through families and neighbors and generations because they have great flavor, because they are a tomato worth saving and worth celebrating. The advantage of an heirloom tomato, in addition to great flavor, is that often the colors are different. The kind of the flavor profile is much wider, and you get some really fun history or stories that are kind of connected to that heirloom tomato. An heirloom tomato also can the seeds can be saved from this fruit. As you grow it this year, you could save the seed and then grow the seed the next year, and it's going to grow back as the same tomato. If it's not an heirloom, it's a hybrid. So this celebrity, for example, is a hybrid, and hybrid tomatoes are hybrid anything is an intentional cross between 2 different types of tomatoes, for example, to encourage some of those reproductive traits to come out in the seedling. So maybe 2 really early and bright red, tasty tomatoes got crossed together to try to produce the best bright red early tasting tomato. So hybrids have been not genetically engineered, but just bred intentionally for various traits. And many hybrids have disease resistance as part of the traits that were bred into them. So you will see disease resistance on the tag. Sometimes you will see abbreviations like V, VF. Those are basically indicating that there are certain diseases that the tomatoes are prone to that particular hybrid is resistant to, or has been bred to not have a problem with. Hybrids, however, different from heirlooms, you cannot save the seed from a hybrid and grow it again the next year and expect it to come back exactly like the year before. So hybrids genetics are still kind of new and unraveling, and so the seed is not stable from year after year. So you buy again a first generation cross from the hybrid every year in order to have it stay as it should. And if you do save the seed, you'll end up with something that's kind of reminiscent of, but perhaps slightly different than that plant that you put in the year before, because it'll have some of the genes of it, but not exactly. So hybrid, heirloom, and then of course, determinate, indeterminate. Now, it doesn't matter as far as flavor goes. If you love a hybrid flavor, then don't let anybody else tell you any different, that heirlooms are better. Heirlooms often have thinner skin, and so they don't ship very well. Heirloom tomatoes are also often, from a tomato lover, they're beautiful, but for average people, sometimes they're kind of ugly or weird looking. Odd colors, bumpy shapes, and different. They're not round all the time, and so sometimes like a bumpy be a tomato called Zapotec ribbed, which is a really cool heirloom tomato. It has ribs in it like a pumpkin. If you think of like the lines on a pumpkin. And the purpose of those ribs on that tomato is that they hold the knife so that your knife doesn't slip off of that slippery round edge of a tomato. So Zapotec ribbed has a great groove to hold your knife so that it's sliceable, and you can make these wonderful tomato wedges. So somebody, of course, thought that that was a fabulous trait and wanted to celebrate and share and keep and continue to grow the Zapotec ribbed tomato. And so those seeds have been passed from generation to generation as an heirloom. The other than, again, the variety of what you choose, which can affect flavor, and lots of tomatoes have different flavors, watering can also affect the flavor of your tomatoes. Now, in containers, you need to water more regularly, and you can't do like deep watering in a container or necessarily a raised bed, because the plants don't have a deep root system. They're in more of a shallow structure. But in ground, we encourage a deep watering, and that may be a slow trickle from the hose for 20 minutes on a plant to get saturation down deep into the soil, rather than just a shallow watering where the roots kind of stay at the surface. That deep watering will allow you usually to water once, maybe twice a week in your in-ground garden versus daily kind of watering when it's hot for your tomatoes in containers. What we have also found is that if you pick your tomatoes immediately after watering, occasionally the flavor can be watered down as well. So if you wait 24 to 48 hours after watering your tomatoes to pick, you'll have more concentrated sugars for a more intense flavored tomato. So just one of those things that, you know, you can hold off to water, then pick your fruits and then water them afterwards. Another thing that affects your harvest, so once you've picked your tomatoes, another thing affects their flavor is if you put tomatoes in the refrigerator. So most of us, I think, probably know not to put ripe tomatoes in the refrigerator, but that actually stops their sugar production. And so the best way to store tomatoes is just, you know, on your countertop, out of the direct hot sun, and actually top down. So like the stem end, you want it to be sitting on the stem end because it's the underside of the tomato that's the most tender. Its little bottom is tender. So you don't want to let it sit and get a bruised bottom. Flip it upside down and set it on the top. The things that I mentioned that go in the hole, the fertilizer, all of the prep that you would do as you're planting, you'll follow back up and feed your tomato granular type fertilizer about every 2 months during the growing season. In containers, you're going to do it a little bit more frequently, so about every 6 weeks. And this is that, again, high performance athlete type fertilizer that's going to help them produce and give you that type of consistent yield so that you get bushels and bushels of tomatoes. If you don't do a lot of fertilizing, or if you don't do regular fertilizing, chances are you're still going to get tomatoes, but your yield will be a little less, or impacted by the fact that the plant just doesn't have as much energy to push out its production. There are some pests that bother tomatoes, but not a lot. We don't get a real serious aphid infestation usually on tomatoes. There is a caterpillar that likes to eat them, and when you see it, it grows pretty fast and it's kind of obvious. But flea beetles can occasionally bother tomatoes. They're a tiny little black bug that can only stay low to the ground. I mean, it can jump a little bit, but I think it can only jump maybe like 8-10 inches. So you may see some holes in the bottom of eggplants and squashes and beans, tomatoes as well. Flea beetles just kind of eat a little bit and make a hole. You can get rid of them with an organic pesticide, but usually my tomatoes just kind of outgrow what a flea beetle can jump to, and then it doesn't become a big issue for me in the garden. There are, as I mentioned, some diseases that tomatoes fall prey to. And those are more difficult to eradicate or to remedy. Tomato locations in your garden should be rotated from season to season. Not growing tomatoes in the same spot every year can help you avoid potentially having a disease that crops up and infects one of your tomato crops. So again, varying or crop rotation and moving those tomatoes around from season to season, or if you know that you've had a disease in the past, choosing a hybrid tomato variety that has resistance to that disease would be a wise choice. Otherwise, you're going to have to find another spot to grow your tomatoes anyway, so that that disease doesn't find your plant by lurking in the soil. There are so many times that I've tried to encourage people to put their cage on a tomato right away. And it looks really funny. I mean, this is a small cage, and I would say if you're growing an indeterminate tomato, get the biggest cage you can, because your tomatoes are going to be large, and the more support they have, the easier it is to pick and to walk between them and all of that. But even this small cage here, if you plant a tomato and you put the small cage on, it looks like a joke for a little while. So you've got a teeny tiny tomato, not even up to the second bar of the cage. But if you wait, if you plant your tomatoes, don't put the cages on them, and wait until they actually need them, then you're looking at a tomato perhaps as big as this one or even bigger. And trying to fit the cage now onto this bigger plant is really kind of a struggle. Might even take two people, and you might have some damage on the plant. So we have a little stake on this one right now while it's at the garden center, but this tomato is growing with the weather. And when you get it home, I would definitely put it in a cage right away so that it has the support it needs, rather than trying to fit it in later. Now, every year up until just this last year, every year except when we have a pandemic, we have had a fall kind of end of season harvest festival event at Dees and 7 Dees called Tomato Tasting. And tomato tasting has really given us the kind of the bookend of information on the season. We know all about how to plant them and what varieties to recommend and all of the fertilizer and everything, but being able to then witness people tasting the tomatoes, getting their flavor notes. We ask people to vote for their favorite tomato, and all of that data and all of that information we've collected for 15 years or so to come up with some of the most popular varieties of tomatoes that helps us recommend to others, maybe new people who haven't tried these varieties. It helps us to order, and based off of the people's votes and the most popular varieties, those are the ones that we're going to order more of, or try to make sure that we have in stock all the time. But one of the things that always amazes me, when we have our tastings, we will taste anywhere from 30 to 50 different varieties of tomatoes. And when we have that many tomatoes sliced up and available for people to taste, almost every one of the tomatoes is someone's favorite. So there's not like 4 tomatoes that are the most popular and then like 30 others that nobody likes. Everyone likes a different tomato because we're all so different and our taste buds are different. So, when I recommend a tomato, I'm recommending what I like to eat. But when you actually get to come to a tasting event, then you really can hone in on like your soulmate tomato, the tomato that you have dreams of that maybe you can or can't yet grow, or haven't yet found to grow in your garden. So when we again are safe to gather in public in groups again, we will be having a tomato tasting event. It's usually the second week of September. And I don't know about this year, but it's doubtful. So check our website always for details on that, and you should see the website address down towards the bottom of your handout. But your handout also has some varieties that we highlight from previous tastings. that have excellent flavor and have been kind of chosen by a lot of people to be really popular. And one of them, I dare say, other than Early Girl, this tomato may be hands down the most popular tomato, at least for us here at Dennis's 70s and in the Portland metro area. This tomato is Sun Gold. Sun Gold is a cherry style tomato. It is kind of orangey yellow. It's a giver. It's very productive, and it's also fairly early. So when we talk about like an early tomato, Early Girl, as I mentioned, the tag on Early Girl tells us that it's 67 days to maturity. Now, 67 days starts when you transplant it, and it's kind of assuming that you've got like a 6-week-old plant that you're putting in, and then the 67 days begin. So you can't be like, oh, well, this is probably already 20 days ahead, so I'm going to be 40 days, I'll be eating tomatoes. Don't do that kind of math. 60 days in the ground after you plant it, and you should be looking at tomatoes. Now, Sun Gold takes 57 days to mature. So 67 for Early Girl, or 62, 64, 57 for Sun Gold. So it is an early tomato, but it is also one of the tomatoes that will be the last producing edible fruit in your garden all the way up till fall. So September, you're still eating Sun Gold tomatoes. And it even makes a fine, you could slice up a bunch to get on a burger. So it's not going to exactly be burger size, but it makes a great sauce. These are fantastic in salads. They're the kind of thing that you'd like fill your shirt pocket when you're out in the garden and just have something to snack on while you're out there. Kids love them. They're very sweet, as many cherries are. So Sun Gold is an outstanding variety to grow if you haven't grown it before. And one complaint that people have on Sun Gold is that sometimes the skin is a little thick and it tends to split and crack, and especially after like a summer rain. So Sun Gold, which is a hybrid, Sun Gold has been improved. There's a new variety similar to Sun Gold, but it's called Sun Sugar. Oh, trying to get this in the screen. So Sun Sugar is a relative of Sun Gold, same maturity is, it's 62 days, so it's a little bit later than Sun Gold. But Sun Sugar has a thinner skin, which means that the fruits are able to the skin's able to stretch a little bit more with the fruit than instead of splitting and cracking. So it's not as prone to the splitting and cracking as Sun Gold is. If you had to complain anything about Sun Gold, I guess that would be it. Now, another cherries are always very popular, but another cherry that I am growing at home this year, this is a determinate variety, and it's actually semi-weeping. So you can kind of see how the trunk is taking a little curve. So it's starting to kind of trail down or weep over. This is a tomato that can be grown in a hanging basket or in a large pot, and trail over the side. So it's determinate and even semi-trailing, and it's called Tumbling Tom Red. So Tumbling Tom is another cherry tomato, but again, one that you could grow in a hanging basket or in a very small space. I've got flower buds already started on this one here, and my Tumbling Tom is at home under grow lights, and it's flowering like crazy. So it is an pretty early tomato to boot. Now on to bigger slicers. There are what we call cold tolerant varieties of tomatoes, and it's not that they're, you can't put them in February or anything. They're not that cold tolerant, but the fruit themselves will set and grow and ripen and have great flavor even in a colder summer or a cooler summer than we might like. So whereas quite a few of the big slicer tomatoes, such as Brandywine, which is a very well-known heirloom slicer, Brandywine takes like 85, 87 days, and you need a lot of good summer sun to get Brandywine to really set a lot of fruit. The cold tolerant varieties don't require that type of environment. So this is a great one that you see on your handout. This is called Moscovich. And Moscovich is an heirloom as well. So you see that on the tag. This is a Russian heirloom. So you can imagine maybe Russian summers. I've never been to Russia, but I'm imagining the Russian summers are not super warm. So going with a tomato that has Russian origins gives us that nice heirloom kind of story and affiliation, but at the same time, 65 days to ripen and fantastic flavor on Moscovich. So this one has gotten a lot of attention in our tastings. One year, actually, I was pretty sure that somebody had salted Moscovich. It even just had like that bright of a flavor that I was afraid someone would put salt on it. So I dumped the whole plate and I chopped up more for the tasting and tasted it. And sure enough, it has kind of a bright, zingy flavor to it. So Moscovich is closer to the on the vine size tomatoes that you get. So not gonna fit a hamburger bun again, but that kind of perfect, maybe tomato for one, or I suppose you could share a tomato that size, but just a perfect size, in my opinion, for one person to eat. Moscovich is fantastic. And, oh, this big girl that I brought in. So our tomatoes range from 4-inch little starts that you can watch grow. You get a head start with a 1 gallon, already a pretty well-developed plant. And on many varieties, we also have 2-gallon tomatoes. So if you maybe don't feel the most confident, you could start with something larger. This 2-gallon tomato already also has a flower on it, even though this is a very long to ripen variety. So this is a yellow tomato. This got 2 years ago, this was best in show. So best flavor voted all around most popular tomato, and it is a Manna Orange. A Manna Orange is an heirloom. It grows to be about 5 inches. So that's 6 inches. So almost as big as my hand. 5-inch tomato. This will fit on your hamburger bun. It is this beautiful kind of yellow gold. It takes 75 to 80 days to ripen. And the heirloom Amana orange comes from the Amana colony in Iowa. So that is, you know, a lot of people are from Iowa or have family in Iowa. And so for me, I have family in Iowa, and I just, you know, you have to grow a tomato to props to your people. So Amana orange is, again, one of those that gives a little bit longer to ripen, but that large slicing beefsteak style tomato with amazing flavor. It's sweet, it's a little tangy, it's got a tiny bit of kind of a tropical fruit flavor to it, and not the high sugars that it has makes it so that it doesn't taste quite as acidic as well. Now, 24, 48 hours, yep. Okay, I've hit all my flavor notes. I guess the last thing I'll mention, it's not tomatoes at all, but it's herbs, because most of us know that really nothing goes better with tomatoes than basil and a little bit of fresh mozzarella. So basil is another one of those plants that is coming into the garden center, is truly the flavor and aroma of summer. Mostly because we can't really dry basil and keep it in the winter. It just doesn't have the same flavor. It doesn't keep and dry with the same amount of intensity as other herbs do. But many of us struggle with basil because we put it in early in the season while it's cool or kind of varying temperatures. And then as the summer warms and we get into warmer conditions, basil usually will kind of freak out, and it starts to make a flower and want to go to seed, and the flavor changes on the basil when that happens. So you can kind of pinch on it and try to stop it from doing that, but usually you just need to harvest what you can and go buy more basil and put it in. This is a basil variety. It's different looking than basil that you might be familiar with. It's kind of a pale green, has a little white edge to it, but it is called Pesto Perpetuo. And the thing about this basil is that it does not go to seed, doesn't flower and it doesn't go to seed. So the one basil plant you have tends to, continue to produce for you through the season and ends up as like a little bush. So about 14, 18 inches tall and maybe about 10 inches wide, makes great pesto. And it's always grown in a container on my deck as one of those kind of fail-safe herbs to just grab and pick when I've got a ripe tomato. Sometimes I just grab a leaf and put the whole thing in my mouth like an instant salad. You guys do that too, I know. And beyond that, I think that's it. I think I'm going to say that is 45 minutes of tomatoes and open it up to questions.
Nicole, I'm going to ask a question from the audience, if you want to just reply here. One question was, when are seeds in a tomato sufficiently mature to be viable for the next season?
Great question. So a fully ripe tomato, just fully ripe like you would pick it and eat it, that's when the seeds are ripe. And if you're going to save seed from a tomato, you want to choose like one of the best tomatoes. You want to save seed from the cream of the crop, the showcase model tomato on the plant. And the neat thing about tomato seeds is that when the tomato seeds are inside the fruit, they have a little gel sac that encloses the seed inside of the gel sac. And the gel sac actually is inhibiting the tomato seed from sprouting. Because in a tomato, it's moist, it's in the sun, so it gets warm. And if the seed didn't have something to stop it from sprouting, it might just sprout inside the tomato. So when you save tomato seeds, you need to kind of squish them out of a tomato, squeeze the fruit until you get the seeds out, and let them go into like a Tupperware, a little low Tupperware container, and add a little bit of water so that you have some kind of juice in there. Then leave it for 2-3 days, and a thin gray layer of mold will grow over the top of that dish of that Tupperware. And that mold is what breaks down the gel sac that encloses the seed. So now, like, commercial seed growers use a chemical in most cases to break that gel sac. But if you just do it the old-fashioned way, they will rot, just like a tomato would rot in the garden. And once it rots, then the gel sac decomposes and the seed is viable to sprout. So best fruit, then allow the gel sac to rot off, then dry, kind of clean and dry your seed, and then you've got it saved for the next year.
Perfect. I hope that I didn't, I think I've unmuted you all, and this would be a great time if anybody just wants to hop on and ask a question. You would just need to unmute yourself. You have been unmuted by us. So I think, Suna, did you have a question?
Yeah, Carrie, I need to ask Nicole. I picked up some tomato plants from 70s. Is it the right time to put them outside right now, or is it too early for that? I have 3 questions, so.
My tomatoes are going in and out. So if I see that the nighttime is going to be below 50 degrees, I'm bringing the tomatoes inside. They're happier staying warmer. And because I haven't planted them in the garden at the moment, I'm just kind of collecting a few varieties. They're going in and out, until it's warm enough for them to be put out into the ground. And most of my tomatoes are going to go in right around Mother's Day.
But the plants, the pot is small and my plants have grown tall and the soil is drying very quickly. Should I be just watering it every day?
Did you get like a gallon size?
No, it is smaller than that. Yeah.
And so do you have any of these types of pots at home, just empty?
Yes.
Most gardens do.
Transfer them. Okay.
Transfer them while you're waiting to put them in the ground. Just transfer them into a bigger pot and you'll be able to keep them watered much easier while again you're waiting, because we've got a good 2 weeks or so before we're going to put them out.
Now, is it too late to start tomatoes from seeds at home?
It is generally too late to start tomatoes from seeds. So we're usually starting seeds in either late February or early March. It does take them a good 6 or 8 weeks or even longer sometimes to become big enough to then go outside. So most people start their seeds real early for tomatoes.
Now, my final question is, could you go over the process to prepare the pot for the planting, planting?
So if we were using the container like this, whether you fill the whole container with potting soil out of a bag or mix up potting soil with a few other amendments is kind of up to you. I like to just do a concoction like I'm cooking some masterpiece in my container. So I'll put in some potting soil. I may add a couple of handfuls of worm castings, and then I'm still going to put in the hole the bone meal, the lime, and the tomato fertilizer. Then if we were planting a sun gold tomato is a good example. So when you plant a tomato, and especially one like this, he's already gotten really big and tall and he's a little bit floppy in the pot. So we're going to plant it deeper in the container than it is in the pot now. And you can really only do that with tomatoes and a few other plants. So to plant it deeper, I take off all of the leaves and branches up to the point where I'm going to plant it. So I'm going to do it up to there. And a tomato will root along the stem. So it has the ability to form roots along the stem. So then in this container, I'm going to